Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy. Today, I'm going to give an interpretation of Dana Coverstone's Yellow Horse Dream. So let's begin by watching it.
Many of you know a couple weeks ago I had this dream on Saturday, August the 26th. So it's been about 3.5, 4 weeks since I had it. And on Sunday morning, I began to say, hey, folks, if you are Native American or have background in Native American history, I need to know about the yellow horse. But so let me just share the dream, folks, and then we'll go on from there, okay? In the dream, I saw a long western wooden fence about 100 yards long that was right beside a hard dirt road, just flat dirt, no gravel, no rock, just hard dirt, brown, hard earth, hard earth. And standing along the fence from end to end for that 100 yards were Native Americans. Now, the men standing on the front end of the fence were all dressed in traditional attire. So if you would have watched a Western from the 1800s or the late, those years, you would have seen them in the native dress and the things on their chests and the hats. And the first man, the very first man in line appeared to be a native chief with the full regalia, okay? And as the men progressed down that line, they became more modern in appearance and in dress and were younger as well. So they kind of went from older to younger, but then they were still very respectably dressed. But you had the very first man was like the chief of an Indian tribe and very majestic, very proud, very professional in that sense. And there were probably 100 men in that line, and they were all looking down at the front end of the fence in deep anticipation. So they're all looking back to where the chief was standing. And across the area from the fence and across from all the Native American men that were there, there was this open platform that was it was 3 tiers high. And it was filled with men on all 3 levels, and they were all dressed in white Middle Eastern clothing. And I'm just going to say this the best way I can. I sense that they were all from Saudi Arabia, okay? So I'm not trying to stereotype, but they all had the chic type hats, and the cloth and the rope tied around, and what you would see when you look at people in Saudi Arabia, okay? Very professional, very traditional. And as I said, I sensed they were all from Saudi Arabia. They were all in various huddled groups. They were talking quietly. They were looking at their phones. So looking at their phones and then talking. And one man in the middle tier, and obviously the leader, he motioned for all of them to sit down with his hands. He turned and just did this. And everybody from top, middle, and bottom tier, they all sat down. They all complied at once, listening to this man. And then the native chief walked to the middle of the dirt road between the fence and the platform. And the platform was literally just about 50 feet on the other side of the dirt road, okay? So he held a medicine stick in his right hand, and he faced down the road, okay? He was just looking down the road towards where what you're about to hear came in. He lifted the stick into the air, and then he struck the ground once and went back to his place on that fence line facing the platform as the first person in that line. And from down the road and coming towards that dirt road were men leading horses. Each handler walked a large and beautiful horse with a thin golden rope line tied to the horse that they were leading. Now the men on all 3 tiers, when they saw these horses, they stood and they looked at each horse that was walking through. And it took some time as they were coming through, but he was watching they're watching these horses very, very carefully. They had small binoculars, and they're making notes, and they were talking aggressively on their phones to people about the horses that they were seeing, okay? One by one, the handlers brought the horses to the middle of the hard dirt road and stopped. And when I say middle, I mean like right in the middle of that 100 yards, like halfway, just they stopped. And they turned and faced their horse, and they stood very firm and quiet. So they lead the horse, they stop, they turn around, they're still holding on the rope, they're looking at their horse. And so the men on the platform and the Native Americans are all watching what's happening here, okay? So they turned and faced the horse, they stood very firm and quiet. Then after a few seconds, they turned and led the horses to the end of the fence line and then beyond. Now, I never saw where the horses went once they passed that end of the fence line. But they walked majestically by those that were walking and watching. And when I say majestic, these horses were trained, they were polished, they were beautiful. They were some of the best horses that I can say I've ever seen in my life. these were like racehorse quality, but they were just very majestic, very pure. Okay. During the dream, at least 100 horses were walked by the crowd of men on both sides. Yet everyone on both sides remained quiet while they walked. Now, the first 75 to 80 horses seemed very mature and very well trained. They were pristine in their discipline and their appearance. But after about the 80th horse, 75th, 80th horse, the following horses were unruly, and they were kicking, and they were trying to pull away from the handlers. And so these handlers, they're pulling, they're jerking, they're trying to maintain their composure and their integrity as a handler. But these horses were getting out of control. The handlers were struggling with controlling them. And I mean, really, really struggling. They kept kicking up, or bowing up on their hind legs and kicking and just being forceful, being awful. And the ropes that I noticed on these other horses that were unruly, they were not the gold smooth ropes, but they were rough and thick. And the handlers with them had very thick gloves on that went all the way up to their elbows. I mean, these gloves were from the tip of their fingers all the way up to their elbows. And they were very rough, like leather, very, very thick. And a few of the more modern dressed Native Americans jumped the fence and they ran out to help the handlers. So basically, the Native Americans were like, these horses are out of control. We got to help the handlers. And so they went to help the handlers with the horses. Now, the handlers that had walked the horses off the field also came running back to help as well. So we had these guys who had been, taking care of the horses earlier that were all nice and pristine. They come running back. And after several minutes of struggle, the last remaining horses were controlled and led off of the road. And the horses that were out of control, just from what I know and from seeing, they were small horses. They were all Mustangs, and they were bucking and kicking and just simply flat out plain wild horses. They were trying to run away, and a few got off the road, but they were subdued with a lot of struggle. It was taking 5 or 6 different guys to grab that thick rope and try to get them back on the road, okay? Once all the horses were corralled and off the road, quiet filled the air again, and the men on both sides of the horses were quiet. The Native American men were quiet. The ones I believe that were representing the Saudi Arabians were quiet. Finally, the chief, who'd been watching, he'd been watching the last several moments with tears. Tears are streaming down his eyes. If you remember the commercial of the Native American man who was watching all the trash, the tears were rolling down both of his eyes. His eyes were moist and wet. His eyes were full of tears. He folded his arms after that last wild horse was escorted through, and he walked to the middle of the dirt road, and he faced the men in the tiers, those 3 tiered platforms. And the leader in the middle tier was suddenly agitated, and he stood up and he said, "I want to see the yellow horse." And the chief just stood there quietly and said nothing. He was in a firm position. He didn't have one foot back. He was just firmly planted, looked at them, arms folded, basically didn't say a word. He just shrugged his shoulders, but he did it very aggressively like this. It was very firm, like, I'm not moving. And the man in the middle tier began to huddle up with about 10 to 12 of those men, and they were upset. They're yelling, and they're making noise and pointing and all sorts of things. And finally they're shaking their fists. They're exhibiting a very angry face. And the man then yells, "We demand to see the yellow horse." And the chief stepped towards that platform. He walked from the middle of the road, off that hard dirt road, walked right up to about 25 feet away from the tier, from the platform. And he looked up. He raised his medicine stick into the air in his right hand, and he just held it there. And he said firmly, "You will not see the yellow horse until he is ready to run." I wrote this down and it was just a one and done dream, which I don't have a lot of those. But I woke up and knew I got to write this down and just began to pray about it, and felt it was one I needed to share.
Believe it or not, this dream confirms my strange interpretation of Dana Coverstone's last dream, called Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. In that dream, Yahushua, aka Jesus, says that he sees and knows everything. Also, He tells us to see with his eyes. I explained that the eyes that Yahushua was talking about are actually the all-seeing eyes of Ra and Horus, which are located in our brains. If you have not seen my interpretation of Dana's last dream, then I strongly encourage you to do so. I'll provide a link in the description box and at the end of this video. So, how does Dana's most recent dream confirm my interpretation of his last dream? Well, Ra and Taurus are depicted as having eagle heads, which is very similar to the chief's eagle-feathered headdress. To many, my interpretation of Dana's last dream might seem like I gave his Christian dream a magical New Age twist. Well, apparently, the Almighty didn't mind this, because his avatar in this dream is a Native American Indian chief who exhibited his authority with a magical medicine stick. What do you think this magical medicine stick represents? It symbolizes a person's central nervous system, which includes the all-seeing eyes of Ra and Taurus within the brain. The rod represents the spine, and the dream catcher represents the skull, where dreams take place. It's called a medicine stick because when the central nervous system is activated, a person's brain will go into hyperdrive and magically heal its body. And so, this ancient knowledge might seem a little magical and New Age to some people. At its core, Dana's dream is about the evolution of the church. According to his dream, in ancient times it used to be majestic, but over time it has become unruly, like a wild mustang. Dana mentioned that he started seeing these unruly mustangs after 75 to 80 of the well-trained horses had already passed by. If we look at the church's 2,000-year history and focus on what happened after the first 75 to 80% of it was over, we would see that the wild mustangs started showing up around the time of the Reformation period, which is when the Protestant church was formed. If you attend church today, chances are that your denomination is a daughter of the Protestant doctrine. Protestant means to protest. Is it any surprise that the wild mustangs in Dana's dream represents the protesting Protestants? So what did the Protestants do to change the church in such a drastic way? First of all, they removed a lot of books from the Bible. But that's not all. The protesting Protestants also removed accountability for their actions, with false teachings like once saved, always saved. Also, many denominations that come from the Reformation movement have quenched the Holy Spirit. And now, a lot of the denominations are in apostasy. These changes didn't happen overnight. It was a slow corruption that took about 500 years to fulfill. When the Mustangs were being rebellious in Dana's dream, it took a lot of people to wrangle them. The young Native Americans who were protected by the wooden fence are the modern messengers from God who have tried to correct the church. Also, the horse handlers of the well-trained horses assisted. These are the teachings of the early church leaders. As the last of the Mustangs were leaving, the Native American chief shed some tears. Why? Because many in today's church are bucking and rejecting him, even though he has sent messengers and leaders to help tame the church. As soon as the Mustangs were gone, the Arabs who were standing on the three-tiered steps demanded to see the yellow horse. Who do you think these men represent? The prejudice within us wants to assume that they are enemies, but I will quickly prove that this assumption is incorrect. According to the Biblical Concordance, the name Arab means step dweller. Do you think that the Almighty giving Dana a dream with step dwellers standing on steps is just a coincidence? Maybe, just maybe, There is more to these men dressed in white robes than what we see on the surface. Dana didn't give much detail about the three-tiered steps, but usually these have a pyramid shape. This is to remind us of the Holy Trinity, which has the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so these step-dwelling men who are dressed in white robes are actually people who have the Holy Trinity dwelling within them. You might be thinking, but why did they seem so impatient? The reason is because these men are those who have overcome, and they were promised a few things. Think about it. How many believers have cried out to God asking, "When is Jesus coming back? When will we be raptured? And when will we see the New Jerusalem?" It doesn't matter if you haven't spoken it audibly. The Almighty knows the murmurings of your heart. And so, yes, these step-dwellers come across as impatient. If the procession of horses represents the history of the church, then the yellow horse must represent the New Jerusalem, the golden city which has been refined and comes from the Father after his judgment. The chief responds to their demands by saying, "You will not see the yellow horse until he is ready to run." This is interesting because it sounds very similar to what Jesus said in a vision Dana had 3 years ago on September 14th, 2020. In that vision, Dana saw Jesus walk into a hospital room and revive an old woman. After reviving her, he warns her not to get up too soon, but when she does get up, she needs to be ready to run. In the Bible, the New Jerusalem is called a bride. More specifically, she is the bride of Christ. As a city, both the Father and Son dwell within her as co-rulers. The step-dwellers want to see the yellow horse. Well, I can tell you that nobody is going to see the yellow horse unless they have the eyes to see. And that is going to require having the all-seeing eyes in your brain activated. Because the yellow horse isn't ready to run, all I can say is that the New Jerusalem that everyone is waiting for is the future church. And so, it's not going to behave like the rebellious Mustangs. Like gold, the yellow horse has been refined. Its members, aka children, must have self-discipline. In the past, the church focused on the death of Christ. But in the future, the church will focus on the marriage of Christ. After publishing my book, God's Master Plan for the Masses, I announced that I would be publishing a follow-up book called God's Master Plan for Salvation. In it, I will be discussing all of this in a lot more detail. I was hoping that the book would be done by now, but unfortunately, it's still not ready. However, it will be soon. My name is Wendy, and you've been called out of darkness.